The courtroom hummed with hushed conversations, a thick cloud of anticipation hanging over the air. Every seat was occupied, people sitting shoulder to shoulder, their gazes locked onto the defendant's table. The name Richard Calloway had flooded news reports for weeks. Now here he was, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people made in a year. He entered with an arrogant smirk, his neatly combed hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. That expression spoke volumes. I own this place, but to everyone else, it felt like pure mockery. Richard wasn't just wealthy, he was untouchable. He had luxury villas on multiple continents, a fleet of private jets, and a conglomerate, Calloway Capital, that had once been seen as a beacon of financial success. But behind the sleek advertising and golden promises, there was deception. He had exploited trust, convincing hard-working families to invest their savings, college funds, pensions, life savings, into what seemed like a golden opportunity. By the time the truth surfaced, the money had evaporated. Homes were lost. Parents had to sit their children down and whisper those gut-wrenching words, "We can't afford it anymore." For many, it wasn't just financial ruin. It was the death of hope. The room stilled as Judge Naomi Sinclair entered, her very presence commanding attention. She was known for her unwavering fairness, her calm but formidable demeanor, and her absolute commitment to justice. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Sinclair," the bailiff announced. As the crowd stood, a single figure remained seated, Richard. He flipped through his notes as if he were skimming through a business agenda. His lawyer leaned in to whisper, but Richard waved him off without so much as a glance. Judge Sinclair didn't acknowledge the slight. Not yet, but an unmistakable tension settled over the courtroom, making the silence thunderous. "You may be seated," she said, her tone steady. And so, the trial commenced. The weight of Richard's actions unfolded, story by story. In the front row sat Lena Dawson, a mother of two who had lost her home because of him. Beside her, Samuel Briggs, a retired paramedic who had spent his life saving others, only to have his own future stolen by Calloway Capital. Lena's voice trembled as she recounted the moment reality hit. "I begged them not to take my house," she said, tears slipping down her face. "I told them I just needed more time, but they didn't care. My kids and I spent nights in a shelter. Do you know what it's like to tell your children there's nowhere to go?" Samuel's testimony cut just as deep. "I spent 3 decades pulling people from burning wrecks," he said, voice raw. "And this man lit my future on fire without a second thought." Yet through it all, Richard barely reacted. He leaned back, scrolling on his phone, occasionally muttering to his lawyer. To him, these weren't victims. They were just numbers on a spreadsheet. The prosecution presented damning evidence. Emails in which Richard personally instructed his team to manipulate financial records. One particular email left the courtroom in stunned silence. "Fudge the numbers. We need them to buy in." Lena shook her head in disbelief. Samuel clenched his jaw. "Richard?" He smirked. When asked to confirm the email, Richard adjusted the microphone, his voice laced with dismissive arrogance. "Yeah, I recognize it," he said with a casual shrug. "But let's not be dramatic. That's just how business works. You wouldn't get it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Sinclair's gavel struck, the sound like a hammer falling on stone. "Order in the court," she commanded, her gaze drilling into Richard. "Mr. Calloway, I suggest you choose your words wisely. This is not a boardroom." But he didn't care. He rolled his eyes, laughed under his breath, and whispered to his lawyer even as victims recounted their pain. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Lena, standing at the witness stand, clutched a worn, crumpled eviction notice. Her hands trembled. "I believed in you," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I trusted you with my family's future. And you," she stopped, her breath hitching. "You ruined us?" Richard didn't even look up. The prosecutor, his voice sharp, cut in. "Your Honor, the defendant isn't even paying attention." Judge Sinclair's eyes were cold steel. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "Put your phone away. Now." Richard exhaled loudly, holding up his phone as if that excused him. "I was checking something important." "I said, now." For a second, He looked like he might argue. But then, with a theatrical sigh, he tossed the phone onto the table, as if doing her a favor. Lena stared at him, disbelief shadowing her face. "How do you sleep at night?" she whispered. By the time closing arguments ended, the case against Richard was unshakable. His lawyer painted him as a misunderstood entrepreneur. But the truth? The truth was written in the eyes of his victims. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. On all counts. On sentencing day, the courtroom overflowed. Reporters pushed to capture every reaction. Victims gripped each other's hands. Richard sat at the defense table, his confidence intact, until Judge Sinclair spoke. "Mr. Calloway," she began, her voice unwavering, "you have been found guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Throughout this trial, you have displayed no remorse, no accountability, and no respect for this court or the people you've harmed." For the first time, Richard's smirk wavered. "I sentence you to 27 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, shock. And Judge Sinclair continued, "I am ordering the liquidation of all your assets. Every penny you stole will be returned." Richard shot up, face red with fury. "You can't do this," he shouted. "I am Richard Calloway. You can't treat me like this." The gavel slammed. "This is my courtroom, Mr. Calloway. Sit down." As officers led him away, the crowd rose to their feet. Applause rang through the chamber. Lena covered her mouth, tears falling freely. Samuel let out a slow, steady breath, relief washing over his face. Outside, reporters crowded around. Lena spoke first. "No sentence will undo what happened," she said. "But at least now, we can start again." For Judge Sinclair, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing a man who thought himself above the law. It was about something greater, justice. And for the first time in his life, Richard Calloway had to face it. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of the verdict still hung in the air. Richard Calloway, once an untouchable giant, a man who wielded power as if it were his birthright, was now nothing more than another convicted fraudster, his empire crumbling around him. The cameras followed his every move as he was led away in handcuffs, his face still twisted in disbelief. For the victims, this wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about the years of hardship, the sleepless nights spent wondering how they'd survive. It was about something deeper. Asterisk, asterisk, vindication, asterisk, asterisk. The system had finally worked in their favor, proving that wealth and arrogance could not buy immunity from justice. Lena Dawson stood outside the courthouse, the cool breeze brushing against her tear-streaked face. She had lost so much, her home, her stability, but at this moment, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Beside her, Samuel Briggs clenched his fists, then slowly released them. For years, the anger had eaten away at him, the betrayal lingering like a wound that refused to heal. But now there was closure. Judge Naomi Sinclair remained in her chambers long after the crowds had dispersed. She knew that no sentence could undo the damage, no judgment could erase the pain. But this was accountability. And for men like Richard Calloway, that was the one thing they had spent their lives avoiding. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a new chapter began, not just for the victims, but for a justice system that had, for once, delivered its promise. For the first time in his life, Richard Calloway had lost. And for everyone he had wronged, that was justice enough.